A city stands on a hill above the sea for 8 months. Then it does not. Rome sent words. Rome did not send an army. 219 BC. Spain. A young general named Hannibal puts a Roman ally under siege and waits for Rome to do something. This is Roman Knights. We go back. We listen. We stay a while. 2 years before the walls fall. He has commanded the army for less than a year. He already knows which war he wants. 1. The shape he found. His first decision as commander was small. He moved the morning briefing from the hour after dawn to the hour before it. The officers would meet in darkness. They would walk out to see the day with their own eyes before talking about it. Several officers asked why. He said, "Reports are what other people saw. I want you to see for yourselves." No one asked again. The second decision was about the maps. His father had kept the maps in a locked chest. Hasdrubal had kept them the same way. Maps were valuable. Maps were also dangerous if they reached the wrong hands. Hannibal took the maps out of the chest. He spread them across a table in the command tent and left them there. Officers who needed them could look at them. The information was no use locked in a chest. The senior map officer came to him and said, "The maps could be taken." He said, "Then we make more maps." He paused. He said, "If someone takes our maps, it means they have been in this tent. If they have been in this tent, maps are not our most urgent problem." The maps stayed on the table. He had inherited 2 things from his father and his brother-in-law. The first was the army, 55,000 men on paper, 42,000 soldiers and 13,000 cavalry and a corps of engineers. African infantry who had been in Spain since Hamilcar arrived. Iberian cavalry who had ridden for Barcid commanders for 9 years. Numidians who fought by instinct and habit, which was more reliable than training. The second was the arrangement, the network of tribes and agreements and silver routes and supply depots that made the army possible. Hasdrubal had spent 7 years building it with patience and marriage and the quiet weight of silver before soldiers. It ran mostly by itself now. The tribes paid because they had calculated that paying was easier than not paying. He had watched both men build. He had his own ideas about what to do with what they had built. He took the army against the Alcaides in the first campaign season. They had sent less than the agreed tribute. Not 0. Less was a test. The tribe was watching to see what the new commander did with less. He did not send a message. He moved the army 6 weeks later than the Alcaides expected. He had sent a trader through their territory in early spring. The trader came back with information. The defensive preparations had declined. He waited 6 more weeks and moved. He arrived before they had organized. The engagement lasted a morning. Their cavalry came out to meet his. His center held for 3 minutes while his Numidian cavalry came around from both flanks. It was over before the full Alcaides force had committed. He lost 11 men. He counted them by name. He did not write the names down. Their leadership came out at midday with the tribute and an explanation. He accepted the tribute. He said nothing about the explanation. He added a condition to the agreement. 30 cavalry riders for the following season. Not as tribute, as service. He wanted their riders learning Carthaginian signals, riding in Carthaginian formations. The elder who negotiated said, "Why riders?" He said, "Because riders learn by riding together." The elder said, "You are building an army." He said, "I am building an arrangement." He was building something. He was not ready to say what it was. The Vacii were larger and more cautious. They had heard about the Alcaides. They had paid their full tribute amount and sent a message about continued good relations. He went to them anyway, not to collect, to be present. He moved the army through their territory for 10 days. He stopped in 3 major settlements and ate with the elders. He listened to things he already knew. He asked about the winter, about the harvest. He was not there for the information. He was there to be a person they had eaten with. Fear was the gap between what you knew and what the other person knew. He was closing the gap. On the 7th day, an elder who had dealt with Hasdrubal asked, "Why are you here?" He said, "Because it is correct to be here." The elder said, "Hasdrubal did not come here. Not personally." He said, "I am not Hasdrubal." The elder said, "What do you want from the Vakii?" He said, "I want the Vakii to know what the arrangement looks like from the other side. I want them to have seen the army and understood that it is real. I want them to know the kind of commander who comes in person." He paused. He said, "One who prefers a meeting to a battle. When a meeting will do." The elder said, "My father dealt with Hamilcar Barca." He said, "Yes." He said, "My father said Hamilcar Barca preferred a battle to a meeting." He said, "We have different preferences." The elder said, "The arrangement holds." He said, "I know." He ate the meal. He slept in Vakii territory that night. He moved out the next morning. The Carpetani came at him on the return march from the Vakii. They had an alliance with the Vakii. They had watched Hamilcar and Hasdrubal operate for years. They had a reasonable plan. They came with a large force and positioned to catch the Carthaginian column on a narrow road. He was not on the road. He had the army in the river before the Carpetani arrived. In the water, crossing. The river was fast and cold, and the crossing was difficult. The Carpetani arrived at the bank. They looked at the army in the water. They made the decision any army in that position would make. They came in. He waited until they were committed to the crossing, until they were in the water fighting the current, unable to go back. Then he hit them from the flank with the Numidian cavalry. The cavalry moved along the bank and entered upstream where the footing was better. They came at the Carpetani from the side while the Carpetani were fighting the river. A man who is fighting water cannot also fight cavalry. The Carpetani losses were substantial. Not total. Enough. He watched the Numidian cavalry come back across when it was done. They moved through the water at a walk now. The urgency was over. He counted the returning riders. He counted the horses separately. 6 men had not come back. He would learn their names before the army made camp. 3 days later, the Carpetani sent a delegation. He received them in his tent. He gave them wine. He listened. He told them what he would accept. The meeting was brief. The agreement was specific. They signed it and left. This was what command was. You found the situation the other side did not expect. You built the wrong situation around the army that had the right tactics for a different situation. The Carpetani had been a good army. They had done everything correctly inside the wrong situation. He was learning how to build the wrong situation. He had been learning this since he was 16. The autumn of his first year, he heard about Helmantica, a city, not a tribe, in the northwest. It had been outside the arrangement system, not because it had refused, because no Barcid commander had gone that far. Hasdrubal had concentrated on the south and the coastal areas. The northwest was a future problem. He decided it was a current problem. He moved northwest with 12,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. The terrain was harder than the plateau. Longer approach, less predictable water. He adjusted. He had sent a messenger ahead, not with terms, with a question. He asked to meet with the city's leadership at a location outside the city's walls. Open ground, easy to reach for both parties. They came. He sat with them for most of a day. He listened to what they understood about the Carthaginian arrangement system. He corrected what was wrong. He confirmed what was right. He presented the terms. The same terms he had presented to every tribe since he took command. The leadership of Helmantica agreed. He had expanded the territory without a battle in the northwest. He filed this separately from the Alcaides. The Alcaides had required the army. Helmantica had required a meeting. The difference was information. He had known more about what Helmantica needed before he arrived. He had sent the question first. He had given them time to prepare an agreement before the army was present. He was learning what the army was for, and what it was not for. He thought about encirclement for most of 2 winters, not the mechanics of it. The mechanics were clear enough from the historical accounts. You wrap your forces around the enemy's position and prevent escape, and the enemy either surrenders or dies. Simple in description. Complicated in execution because you needed to control the timing and the movement of 4 separate forces at once. The problem with encirclement was that the enemy had to cooperate. The enemy had to move forward. The enemy had to move into the space you had prepared. The enemy had to keep moving forward even when it should have stopped. An enemy that stopped and formed a defensive position could not be encircled in the same way. The Roman machine moved forward. This was its design. But why did it move forward when it should not have? He had found 2 battles where this had happened. He read them again and again. He thought about what the Roman commanders had been seeing, what they had been thinking, at the moment when moving forward became the wrong decision. Both times, the commanders had not known they were being encircled. They had seen the enemy in front of them falling back and had interpreted this as success. They had pressed the advantage. The advantage was not what it appeared. He had the first element of the plan. The center falls back, deliberately, controlled, making the Roman line believe it is winning, making the machine go forward into the space being created. Then the wings close. He drew the diagram for the first time in the 3rd winter. He was alone in the tent. The camp was quiet. He had a piece of charcoal and a flat sheet of leather. He drew the Roman line across the top. He drew the Carthaginian position below it. He drew the Carthaginian center. He drew the wings. Then he drew what happened. The center moved back, up on the diagram toward the Roman line, not breaking, moving in a controlled way that looked like pressure but was actually an invitation. The Roman line moved forward, down on the diagram, into the space. Then the wings. He drew the wings rotating, not moving straight forward, moving in arcs, coming around. The left wing sweeping right, the right wing sweeping left. He looked at the diagram. The Roman machine was inside the arc. The center had held. The wings had come around. The Roman machine was surrounded. The machine's design required it to fight forward. It was already inside a space it could not fight its way out of. The machine would keep pushing forward. The space was closing on all sides. He looked at the diagram for a long time. He was 23 years old. He had found the shape. He needed the ground now. He needed a flat plane where 4 forces could see each other and coordinate movement across large distances. He needed an enemy that would commit its full force rather than sending probing units. He needed the enemy to believe when the center fell back that the center was breaking. The Po Valley in northern Italy had flat plains. He had accounts of them. He needed to get to the Po Valley. That required other things first. He folded the leather and put it away. He needed to learn more before he was ready. He spent the next year learning tactics he already knew better. Not to improve them, to understand them from the other side. He had his officers run drills where he was on the opposing side. He took command of a reduced force and let the full army practice against him. He studied what the commanding officer on the full army side saw and thought. What did a general see when the center began to fall back? He saw the center falling back. He saw an opportunity. He moved his best units forward to press the opening. He committed. How long did it take to understand that the falling back was not breaking? Too long. By the time you understood, the wings were already closing. He ran this drill with variations for a full campaign season. He changed the timing of the wing movement. He changed the depth of the center's retreat. He changed the ground. He found the conditions where it worked best and the conditions where it failed. It worked best on flat ground with good visibility and a committed enemy. It failed on broken ground where the wing movement was slowed. It failed when the enemy held reserves back rather than committing fully. He noted both failure conditions and thought about how to eliminate them. For broken ground, choose the right battle site. This was his responsibility. Choose flat. For enemy reserves, you needed the enemy to believe before the battle that they had the advantage. A general who believed he had the advantage committed his reserves. A general who doubted held them back. He thought about how you made an enemy believe he had the advantage. The answer was the approach march. If you arrived at the battle site looking like you were at a disadvantage, the enemy would commit. If you arrived with obvious strength and good position, the enemy would be cautious. He filed this. You arrived tired, or short of food, or with your cavalry in poor condition. Something visible that told the opposing general, this is the moment to press. He had all of this worked out by the end of his 25th year. He was 2 years from being ready to use it. The Roman army had one more weakness he thought about. It was not a tactical weakness. It was a strategic one. Rome's army was an annual army. It raised new legions each year. The men served for a campaign season and went home. The officers served longer. But the machine itself was rebuilt each year. This meant that the Roman army, for all its tactical strength, had a limited structural memory. Each year's army learned from the previous year's officers. But learning from officers was slower than learning from experience. A professional army that stayed together for years developed something an annual army did not. It developed the ability to adapt in the middle of a fight. Individual soldiers who had fought together long enough learned to coordinate without orders. They filled gaps without being told. They held positions without being held there. His army had this. They had been together for years, some of them since his father's time. The Numidians had been in Spain for 15 years, the Libyans for 12, the Iberian cavalry for 7 or 8. They knew each other. They knew what the man beside them would do. They knew what the man behind would do when things went wrong. The Roman legions that would face them in Italy would be new, not untrained, new to each other. They would fight well inside the Roman system. They would fall apart at the edges of the system faster. This was the third element of the plan. He did not have a name for the plan as a whole. It was not the kind of thing that needed a name. It was a shape in his head, a sequence of positions and movements. 7 years of work. It required one specific piece of ground to execute. He was going to find that ground. He walked the perimeter alone now. The morning walks his father had started. The pattern was the same stops, the same looking, the same silence. He had been doing them since his father died. First because it was the right thing to do for the camp. Later because he needed them. The morning walk was the time when he could think without the day's requirements interrupting. The camp was quiet. The ground was visible. The light was coming. He stopped at the same places his father had stopped. The rise in the ground, the gap in the trees, the bend in the river. He did not look at them the same way his father had looked. He had his own version of looking now. 19 years of camps had given him his own version of the thing his father had taught him. The ground still had things to say. He was still willing to hear them. 3 steps back, where his father used to be, there was empty space. He had stopped noticing the space the way you stopped noticing any permanent thing. It was there. It had always been there. It would continue to be there. 2. The trader in the market. 2 years before the siege, he went into the city as a trader. Not alone. He took for men. Iberian dress, Iberian horses, goods that traders carried. 3 days. He had arranged the cover identity through the merchant networks he had been building in the eastern settlements. He had done this kind of reconnaissance twice before. Once as part of his father's operations in the early years. Once on his own before the Helmantica negotiation. He had learned the principles from his father and refined them from the experiences. The principle was simple. You needed to know the thing you were planning against. Not from reports, from your own eyes. Reports told you what other people had seen. Your own eyes told you what was there. Saguntum was different from what the reports had suggested. The reports said, a city of approximately 20,000. Walls in good condition. Greek and Iberian construction mixed. Elevated position, significant tactical advantage. What the reports did not say, the quality of the stone in the lower courses. The way the wall met the hill at the eastern approach. The 3 places where the drainage had compromised the foundation work over generations of rain. He found all 3 places on the first day. He did not rush. He moved through the market in the lower quarter the way traders moved. Slowly, looking at things, picking up goods and setting them down. Speaking to vendors in the Iberian he had learned since he was 9. His accent was good. His commercial manner was adequate. The vendors sold to him and asked no questions. He noted the exits from the market. 3, not counting the narrow passage behind the Temple of Aphrodite. He always included the narrow passage. He always noted the exits. Habit. Africa. He had tried to stop. He had not. On the second day he went to the eastern approach. He moved along the base of the wall. Stalls had set up in the shadow of the stone. Cloth merchants. An oil seller. A man who repaired sandals. There were stalls along the wall on the eastern side. Cloth merchants and oil sellers and a man who repaired sandals. He bought a pair of sandals. He paid slightly too much. The sandal maker was pleased with him and did not watch him closely after the transaction. He put his hands on the wall in 3 places. Not dramatically. He leaned against it at one point while inspecting the sandal. He rested a hand on it while looking at the oil merchant's selection. The 3rd time he simply stopped and put both hands flat on the stone and felt the surface. The stone told him things that the reports had not told him. Stone that has been standing for 200 years has a specific quality. Not weakness. History. The history shows in the surface where, in the way the lower courses have settled into the ground, in the hairline separations between the original construction and the later repairs. He found one section on the eastern face where the repair was substantial and relatively recent. The color of the stone was slightly different. Lighter. He looked at the angle where the new stone met the old. The angle was not quite right. The repair had been done correctly but in a hurry. Done correctly in a hurry was still done correctly. But the joint was a different kind of correct than the surrounding original construction. He moved on. That afternoon he walked to the northern section. The northern wall was lower than the eastern. The ground dropped away there and the defenders had used the natural advantage. Where the ground dropped, the wall did not need to be as high. The effect from outside was the same. But the foundation work on the northern side went into less stable ground. He found it at the 3rd place he looked. The ground at the base of the northern wall had a quality to it. The way certain kinds of ground looked when what was underneath had moved. Not catastrophically, slowly, over decades, the kind of slow movement that was never a crisis, until something applied pressure to the right point. He filed this. He filed the angle. He filed the approximate location on the wall relative to the tower he could use as a reference point. He bought more goods he did not need and went back to the market. On the third day he looked at the gates. There were 3 gates in practical use and 2 that had been sealed since before anyone currently alive could remember. The sealed gates interested him. Not because he would use them, because what was sealed was information about how the city had been built. What had been important once and was not important now. The main gate was on the southern approach, wide enough for 2 carts, well constructed. The guards were organized. He counted the rotation. Every quarter hour a different pair at the main station. He watched this 3 times to confirm the interval. The eastern gate was smaller. 1 cart. Less guard activity. The relief interval was irregular. He filed the irregularity. The western gate was smallest. Pedestrian traffic only. He went through it and walked around the outside of the city wall for 2 hours in the early afternoon. He moved the way a man moved when he had no particular purpose. He had a specific purpose. He was looking at the wall from the outside. He found the limestone shelf at the base of the eastern section. Limestone shelf under wall construction was a specific problem. Limestone was strong until it was not. It did not crack the way other stone cracked. It dissolved, slowly over time with water. A wall built on dissolving limestone sat on a foundation slightly less solid than it appeared. He put his boot on the limestone shelf where it was exposed at the base. He pressed his thumb against his knuckle. He had what he came for. He left the city on the 3rd morning. At the eastern gate, the guard was on the irregular interval. He timed his departure to the gap. He rode south for 4 hours before stopping. He sat in the shade of a rock formation beside the coast road and drew what he had seen. Not on paper, in the air, with his finger, the wall as he had walked it, the 3 points he had found, the angle of the eastern repair, the limestone shelf, the drainage compromise on the northern face. He drew it until he had it in a form he could keep. Not on paper. Here. He put his hand to his temple. The way his father had done in the winter camps of Spain. He was 11 then. Paper can be lost. Paper can be taken. The enemy can read paper. The enemy cannot read this. He put his hand down. He had the picture. He had the 3 points. He had the foundation of a timeline. 2 more years to build it. The information now existed. He rode south. 2 years later, the army arrived at the ridge above the city. He stopped the column and looked at the eastern wall for a long time. The repair section was exactly where he had filed it. The angle was exactly what he had memorized. The color of the newer stone was slightly different from the surrounding original construction. His chief engineer Bostar stood beside him. He said, "The eastern section. The repair work near the 3rd tower from the northern end." Bostar looked. He said, "What about it?" He said, "It is the weakest point on this wall. The joint between old and new stone is not fully integrated. 200 yards south of it, the limestone shelf is exposed at the base. The shelf has been dissolving for as long as this wall has stood." Bostar looked at the wall for a long time. He said, "You have been here before." He said, "I was here 2 years ago." Bostar said, "As a trader." He said, "I needed to see it." He always counted the exits. He always needed to see it himself. These were the same habit at different scales. He checked the exits. There were 3 workable exits from the eastern approach. He noted all 3 before he ordered the first assault position. He always counted exits before he committed to a position. Saguntum was the problem he had been looking at since he took command. Not the city itself. What the city represented. It sat south of the Ebro, in territory that Carthage considered its sphere of authority. It was also a formal ally of Rome. Hasdrubal had signed a treaty with Rome 11 years before that put the Ebro as the boundary. Carthage would not cross north. Rome would not interfere south of it. Saguntum was south of the Ebro. Saguntum was also Rome's ally. These two facts could not be convenient at the same time. He had been looking at this contradiction for 2 years, not as a legal problem, as a military one. A city south of the Ebro that Rome protected was not just a city. It was a statement. The statement said that the Ebro Treaty meant whatever Rome wanted it to mean. That Carthaginian authority in Spain was whatever Rome permitted. He was not interested in what Rome permitted. The contradiction had to resolve. He was going to be the one who resolved it. The Roman embassy came in the winter before the campaign. A formal delegation from the Senate. They were polite. They used the language of diplomacy. They said that Saguntum was under Rome's protection. Any action against it would be considered a hostile act. He received them in his tent. He gave them wine. He listened to everything they said. He said that the Saguntines had treated Carthaginian traders very badly for several years. He was addressing a matter of justice and order in territory under Carthaginian authority. The lead ambassador said again, more plainly, "This is a hostile act against Rome." He said he understood their position. He thanked them for coming. They left. He had made his decision before the embassy arrived. The embassy had not changed anything. He had received them because that was the correct thing to do. The record should show he had listened. The record would show what it needed to show. He took the army south in the spring of his 27th year. The road from Cartagena to Saguntum was 3 days along the coast. The army moved at march pace. There was no reason to hurry and every reason to arrive in the right condition. He rode near the front. He had been thinking about Saguntum for 2 years. The approach, the hill, the eastern face where the ground rose more gradually before the final pitch to the walls. The 3 exits he had noted when he walked the city as a trader. He had been planning this the way he planned everything. Slowly, from different angles, until the shape was clear. The shape was clear. The question had never been whether to take Saguntum. The question had been when and under what conditions. He had answered both. The conditions were the best they would be. The time was now. They arrived on a morning in spring. He stopped the army at the ridge above the city and looked at it for a while. The walls were as he remembered, old and well built. The people inside had used the winter to prepare. He could see the evidence of preparation in the positions on the wall. The guard density, the equipment at the parapet. They had known he was coming. Good. He preferred an opponent who had prepared. An opponent who had prepared had committed to a position. A committed opponent was easier to predict than one who had not yet decided what to do. 3. The message from Rome. The Roman embassy arrived in winter. 3 men, a senior senator named Valerius, 2 others younger who served as witnesses and recorders. They came with the formal manner of men who are delivering a position, not opening a negotiation. He received them in the command tent at Carthago Nova. He had known they were coming 3 weeks before they arrived. His intelligence in Rome was not large. It was specific. He had traders who traveled regularly between Carthago Nova and the Italian ports. He had a Campanian merchant who attended Senate sessions in the public galleries. He knew the public sessions. He knew the mood. He knew which senators were pressing for action on the Saguntum question and which were counseling patience. The mood had shifted in winter. A faction was arguing that Carthage needed to be reminded of its treaty obligations, that a direct communication to the Barcid commander was necessary. His Campanian contact had written about this shift 3 months earlier. He had 3 months to decide how to receive the embassy. He decided to receive it as a formality. Valerius spoke for approximately 40 minutes. He outlined the Roman position. He cited the treaty. He cited Saguntum's status as a Roman ally. He cited various precedents. He spoke in the smooth Latin of a man who had been preparing for weeks. He was persuasive. He was precise. He did not say anything that could be taken out of context. He was very good at his job. Hannibal listened. He let Valerius finish. He did not interrupt. He did not indicate agreement or disagreement. He listened with the quality of attention his father had taught him. The attention that said, "I am receiving everything you are saying. I have not finished receiving it." When Valerius finished, Hannibal said nothing for a moment. He thought about what Valerius had not said. Valerius had not said, "If you move against Saguntum, Rome will send an army." He had cited the treaty. He had cited Saguntum's status. He had described the relationship. He had not said what Rome would do if the relationship was disrupted. A negotiator who does not state consequences is either keeping them for later or does not have them to state. He filed this. He said, "I understand Rome's position." He said, "I am aware of the treaty. I am aware of Saguntum's status." He paused. He said, "Saguntum has been conducting raids against tribes under Carthaginian protection. These tribes have agreements with Carthage. I am responding to those violations." Valerius said, "Saguntum is under Roman protection." He said, "The tribes are under Carthaginian protection." Valerius said, "The treaty places the Ebro as the boundary." He said, "The boundary I am operating south of is the Ebro." There was a silence. Valerius said, "I will carry your response to the Senate." He said, "I hope the Senate finds it useful." The embassy left. He poured his wine onto the ground and did not refill the cup. He had made his decision before the embassy arrived. The embassy had not changed anything. He had received them because the correct thing to do was to receive them. The record should show he had listened. The record would show what it needed to show. That evening he called his 5 most trusted officers together. He described the meeting. He told them what Valerius had said and what he had not said. He said, "Rome is not yet ready to move." One of the officers said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because a man who is ready to move says, 'If you do this, we will respond with that.' He tells you the cost. He makes the threat specific." Valerius made no specific threat. He said, "Rome has a debate. The faction that wants action is present. The faction that counsels patience is still larger." Valerius came with a message. He did not come with an ultimatum. He said, "We have a window." The officer said, "How long?" He said, "The embassy will return to Rome. The Senate will debate the response. This takes weeks. Rome may send another embassy, or they may go to Carthage directly. Each step takes time." He looked at the officers. He said, "The siege of Saguntum begins in 30 days. He said, "By the time Rome has decided what to do, we will be in our 2nd month." He said, "By the time Rome can move an army, we will be done." He said, "This is the calculation." He did not say, "And if the calculation is wrong." He had thought about that. He had thought about it the way his father had tested river crossings, with his boot in the water, measuring what he could, acknowledging what he could not. He had measured what he could. He had made the decision. The distance is right. He said nothing else. The officers understood. He stood at the entrance to the tent after they were gone. He thought about what Valerius had not said. He thought, a negotiator who does not cite consequences is measuring the situation, not closing it. He thought, they will send another embassy. He thought, I will not be here for it. He walked to the edge of the camp. Late afternoon. Spain in winter had a low orange light at this hour. The hills west of Carthago Nova went dark from the bottom up as the sun descended. He had been looking at this view for 5 years. He said, the distance is right. Quietly, to no one. Then he turned back. He had a letter to write to Carthage. He had a letter to write to his brother Hasdrubal, who would hold Spain. He had a plan to finalize and supply routes to confirm and a siege that would begin in 30 days. He went to work. He always moved faster after the decision was done. That evening he wrote to Carthage. He wrote about the embassy. He described the conversation accurately. He described Rome's position and his response. He said he expected a second embassy. He said the second embassy would arrive after the siege had begun. He said he was proceeding. He did not ask for permission. He had not asked for permission since he took command. The Carthaginian Senate had approved his command. The army had voted for his command. What he did within that command was his to decide. He informed them. He did not wait for responses before acting. His father had done the same. His father had been sent to Spain. Carthage did not know what else to do with him after the war. He was aware that being useful from a distance was not the same as having the Senate's trust. He was also aware that if he won, the question of trust would not be relevant. He wrote the letter. He wrote another letter to the commanders in each section of the preparation. He updated the timeline. He gave the signals for when the preparation became the movement. He sealed both letters and gave them to riders. The riders left before dawn. He sat in the tent for a while after they were gone. The camp was quiet. Spain was dark outside. Somewhere south of him, Saguntum was lit with its own fires. A city that did not know how much preparation had gone into the plans for it. He thought, this is what it looks like from the outside. A city standing on a hill. Walls, light, people inside who believe they are protected by Rome. He thought, this is what it looks like from the inside of the planning. Data, supply delivery rates, guard rotation schedules, the weak point in the eastern wall. He had identified it 2 years ago, walking through the market as a trader. Both were true. The city was real. The people inside it were real. The wall was real. The weak point in the wall was real. He had made the decision. He went to the maps. He did not stay up late. He made the decision. He looked at the maps. He confirmed it was correct. Then he put the maps away and slept. He always slept after deciding. It was not peace. It was practice. The second Roman embassy arrived 3 months into the siege. Not at Carthago Nova. At the siege camp. They came down the coastal road from the north. The army was already in its second phase by then. The first assault towers had been moved up and destroyed in the Saguntine sortie of the second month. He had revised the approach and settled into the systematic work of the tunnel teams and the rotating assault pressure. The second embassy was also 3 men. A different lead senator, younger than Valerius. His name was Fabius. He received them in the command tent at the siege perimeter. The same formality as before. He offered the same hospitality. He listened to the same argument with different words. This time, Rome had added one thing. Fabius said, "The Senate of Rome formally demands that the siege of Saguntum be lifted." He said, "I understand." Fabius said, "And that Carthage will be held responsible for the consequences if it is not." He said, "I have forwarded Rome's position to Carthage." Fabius said, "The demand is directed at you." He said, I am a general. I operate in the field. Political decisions of this nature require Carthage. Fabius looked at him. He said, "You know Carthage will not respond in time." He said, "I do not control Carthage's schedule." Fabius said nothing for a moment. He said, "We will go to Carthage." He said, "I will provide an escort to the port." Fabius said, "We do not need an escort." He said, "I know. The offer is courtesy." The embassy left. He stood at the perimeter wall that evening and looked at Saguntum. The third month had changed it, not the walls. The walls were still standing. The eastern face had 3 tunnel points and the engineers were running ahead of schedule. The walls would not stand much longer. What had changed was the sound of the city. In the first month, the city had made active sounds. Movements, voices, activity at the parapets. The sounds of a city that was organized and responding. In the third month, the sounds were different, quieter, not silent. The sounds of a city that was conserving, that had stopped doing the things that were not essential. The sound of what remained when the optional was removed. He stood at the perimeter and listened. He pressed his thumb against his knuckle. He thought about the 3-month mark, about the shift in sound, about what that meant for the 5-month calculation. The city was holding, but it was holding differently than in month 1. He thought, they are running their own calculation. They know we are outside. They know what the stores look like at month 3. They are deciding how much longer they can maintain. A city that is deciding is a city that has accepted the question. He went back to the maps. He was wounded in the 4th month. A Saguntine javelin from a sortie. He had been at the forward position observing the morning assault. The sortie came out of the southern gate at an unexpected angle. His bodyguard moved. The javelin caught him at the thigh. He went down. The wound was deep but had not hit the bone. He could tell this by how the leg moved under him. Bone hits were different. He had seen enough of them. He said, "Continue the assault." His officers looked at him. He said, "Continue." He walked to the medical section. He allowed the wound to be cleaned and bound. He gave instructions about the binding. He had specific ideas about the binding, tightness, based on what he had observed in previous wounds. He slept that night in the command tent. He was back at the forward position the next morning. He had understood this. The speed of his return was information for the men. A commander who stayed in the medical section for 4 days was a commander whose absence was felt. A commander who returned the next day was a commander whose presence was the default. He pressed his thumb against his knuckle. The wound had stiffened his left leg slightly. He noticed the adjustment his body made. He filed it. He would be at the forward position every morning the wound allowed it. The wound allowed it for the next 4 months. The 5th month was when the city began to come apart. Not all at once. In pieces. The parapets that had been fully defended began to show gaps. The sortie frequency dropped. The sounds at night changed again. Less conservation now. Something closer to exhaustion. He walked the perimeter on the morning of the 140th day. He counted. 140 days. Against his estimate of 150 for the outer boundary and 100 for the inner. He was at 140. He pressed his thumb against his knuckle. He told his engineers, 4 weeks. They had the tunnel at 2 breach points. They had the assault towers repaired and repositioned. They had 3 assault cohorts that had been rotating in reserve for 6 weeks. He told his officers, the city will fall in 4 weeks. He told them the specific sequence of the final assault. He went to sleep. He always slept after deciding. It was not peace. It was practice. For, before the walls, the road from Cartagena to Saguntum was 3 days along the coast. The army moved at march pace. The cavalry first, then the infantry in rotation, then the engineers with their equipment, the supply wagons at the intervals where the road widened. He had designed this march order 6 months earlier. He had revised it twice. The version moving now was the third. The road smelled of pine resin and salt. The sea was to the east, the hills to the west. An army that size made its own weather of dust and sound. The particular heat of many bodies moving in the same direction. He rode near the front, far enough back to hear the army behind him. An army has a sound that changes with its mood. He had been listening to this sound for 19 years. He knew what it meant when the sound was tight and regular. This army's sound was tight, good. He stopped the column at the ridge above the city. He looked at the walls. The walls were as he remembered, old and well-built. The repair section at the eastern face, just as he had noted 2 years ago. The limestone shelf exposed at the base. The guard positions on the parapet were more dense than they had been on his visit. The defenders had been watching the road south. They had known he was coming. Good. He preferred an opponent who had prepared. A prepared opponent had committed to a position. A committed opponent was easier to predict. He did not approach immediately. He walked around the base of the hill for 2 days, looking, the same way his father had walked the perimeter of the camp each morning, looking at the angles, looking at where the ground rose and where it did not, how the light hit the walls at different times of day, where the shadow fell. He checked the exits, 3 workable exits from the eastern approach. He noted all 3 before he ordered the first assault position. He always counted exits. On the 3rd day, he gave the orders for the engineers to begin. He had assigned specific men to specific tasks. Bastar for the tunnel assessment, the Libyan units for the assault towers, the Greek engineers for the catapult placement. The orders were specific. He had been drafting them since winter. The army went to work. The assault towers were the first visible part. For towers, large wheeled structures, each carrying 30 men on the upper platform. The wheels were the difficult part. The ground on the eastern approach was uneven. The engineers spent the first 2 weeks laying a surface the wheels could use. Timber planks pinned to the ground, leveled. The approach was narrow. They could only bring 2 towers forward at a time. The towers took 7 days to build. He watched the construction each morning. He asked the same questions each day. Condition of the timber, progress on the platform joints, status of the wheel assembly. The engineers gave him numbers. He compared the numbers to the numbers from the previous day and noted the rate of progress. The towers were ready on the 8th day. He did not use them immediately. He had the engineers wheel them to the forward position and leave them there. The defenders on the walls watched the towers arrive. They knew what was coming. He wanted them to know. He wanted them to spend time preparing for the towers. While they prepared for the towers, his other engineers began the tunnels. The tunnels were the slower tool and the more important one. Saguntum's walls ran along the bedrock of the hill. The bedrock was limestone. Limestone had a specific response to tools and sustained heat. He had read about the technique in siege records he had studied in the years before command. He had 3 teams working 3 separate tunnel approaches. Each team had specific targets, not the walls themselves in the first phase, the foundations of the corner towers. A corner tower that lost its foundation settled. The settling created hairline fractures in the adjoining wall sections. The fractures became cracks. The cracks became gaps. This was not the method of a man who wanted to breach in a week. This was the method of a man who had planned for 8 months. He walked the tunnel approaches every morning. He asked specific questions. He wanted the count. Meters advanced, cubic meters removed, current temperature of the face, water encountered. He got these numbers every morning and filed them. In the first week, the count was at the line. In the second week, the count was above the line. He noted this. His engineers were performing at the upper end of the range he had calculated. He adjusted his estimate. The timeline might close faster than planned. He set the rotation at 10 days. He did not rotate himself. He wrote to Carthage before the siege was 2 days old. The letter would start the formal record. His version of events. The Saguntines had been hostile to Carthaginian trade for years. He was addressing a matter of order in territory under Carthaginian authority. He was not attacking Rome. He was enforcing Carthaginian rights. All of this was technically accurate. He wrote it with care. He did not know how the council would respond. He had considered the range of possible responses. The most likely, the council would support him publicly, while privately deciding that whatever happened was his decision and his responsibility. He had planned for this. He was responsible. He had made the decision. The decision was made. He sent the letter and went back to the engineering plans. He stood at the forward position that first evening and looked at the eastern face. The torches on the walls moved. The shapes of the guards in the light. The specific quality of dark above the torches and light below them and the city in between. 8 months. That was his estimate. The city had stored food for 9 months at wartime rationing. His model said 8 months was the inner boundary. 9 was the outer. He had planned around 8. He had the window before Rome could respond with force. He had calculated the window. He was within it. He went back to the command position. He had work to do. The walls of Saguntum were Iberian in their lower courses and Greek in the upper. Not because the people of Saguntum could not decide what they were. Because the city was old enough to have been built in layers. The lower stone was rough cut, fitted without mortar the way Iberian builders worked. The upper courses were more regular. Smaller stones. More precisely placed. The Greeks who had traded here for generations had brought their methods with them. The methods had gone into the walls. This told him something about the defenders. A city with 2 different building traditions in its walls had been surviving long enough to know how. The people inside understood stone. They had been managing stone and elevation and the specific advantage of a hill for generations. He would not take this city in a week. He had not planned to take it in a week. The first month of the siege was about engineering. He had 1,200 engineers from 3 different traditions. Libyan engineers who built siege equipment the old Phoenician way. Iberian engineers who knew the local stone and the local ground better than anyone. And a small group of Greek engineers hired in Massalia before the march south. They knew the theory of siege mechanics in a way the others did not. He used all 3 traditions. The Libyans built the main assault towers. 4 of them, large structures on wheels, each carrying 30 men on the upper platform. The wheels were the difficult part. The ground on the eastern approach was uneven. The engineers spent the first 2 weeks laying a surface the wheels could use. Timber planks pinned to the ground. Leveled. The approach was narrow and they could only bring 2 towers forward at a time. The Iberians reinforced the camp. The siege would last as long as it lasted. The camp needed to be permanent. Permanent drainage. Permanent kitchens. Permanent horse lines and feed stores. The Iberians knew how to build this in Spanish soil. Rocky and uneven. It did not cooperate with standard camp construction. The Greeks worked on the catapults. The catapults were for the defenders on the walls, not to break the walls. Stone walls of this thickness did not break from catapult fire. Not unless you had months and specific machinery. He had months. He did not have that kind of machinery. A man defending a wall was a man in a fixed position. He had to stand at the parapet to see what was coming. To see what was coming, he had to expose himself. When he exposed himself, the catapult became relevant. He had seen this principle used against walls twice before in accounts he had read. Sustained catapult fire at parapet level reduced the number of defenders willing to stay at the parapet. This was the theory. Reduced defenders meant reduced effectiveness of the wall. The Greek engineers placed 4 catapults at positions where the angle to the eastern parapet was manageable. They ranged them for 3 days. They found the positions. On the morning of the first assault, the catapults fired at the parapet. The assault towers moved forward behind the catapult fire. The defenders on the walls had prepared for towers. They had not prepared for towers preceded by sustained catapult fire at parapet level. The first day was not a success. The towers reached the wall and the defenders pushed them back. But the defenders lost more people at the parapet in that morning than they expected to lose. He noted this. He set the rotation at 10 days. 10 days at the forward positions. 10 days in the rear camp. The forward positions were the assault teams, the engineers at the towers, the catapult crews. The rear camp was the cavalry, the supply units, the repair teams. He did not rotate himself. He moved between forward and rear as the day required. He slept in the forward camp and ate with whatever unit was on rotation that week. He had made this a practice in every command. You ate with the men you commanded. Not every meal. Often enough that it was not special. On the 3rd week, he ate with the Numidian cavalry unit that had been in Spain the longest. Most of them had been here since his father's time. The oldest of them were 50, which was old for a cavalryman. They had stayed. He asked one of the older riders why he had stayed in Spain, why he had not returned to Africa after Hamilcar died. The man thought about it for a moment. He said, "The work was not finished." He said, "And now?" The man said, "Also not finished." He nodded. He ate the rest of the meal. He thought about the work not being finished on the ride back to the forward position. His engineers found the weakness in the northern base of the eastern tower in the 7th week. Not the wall itself, the foundation under the wall. The eastern section of Saguntum's wall had been built on a base of cut stone set in the hillside. Solid work. But in one section at the northern end, the cut stone rested on a shelf of softer rock. Limestone, the kind that could be worked with iron tools. Bastar brought him to the section at night and showed him by lamplight what the surface looked like. He put his hand on the limestone. He felt the texture of it. He pressed with his thumb and felt it compress slightly. He said to Bastar, "How long?" Bastar said, 2 weeks of work at the base. Then 1 assault at the right moment. He said, "Begin tonight." The night work was quiet work. Iron tools wrapped in cloth where possible. The sound of digging went into the hill and the hill absorbed some of it. The defenders above could hear it. They poured water down. The water made the limestone harder in some ways and easier in others. They worked for 2 weeks and the section was ready. The grain question was the center of the siege. Not the walls. Not the engineering. Not the assault timing. The grain. He had calculated from the pre-siege intelligence and his model of population and consumption. Saguntum had stored grain for approximately 9 months at wartime rationing. This was the outer boundary. It was possible the stores were larger. It was possible the rationing was more severe than he had modeled. He had built the siege timeline around the grain estimate. 8 months to the inner boundary, 9 to the outer. He had set his planning around 8 months. The expectation was that the inner boundary would bring the city to terms. Before the outer boundary was reached, the siege was at its core a race against the grain stores. He was racing to take the walls before the grain ran out. A city that ran out of food before the walls fell surrendered differently. Not the same as a city taken by assault. Surrender through starvation was slower and messier and cost more of the population in ways that were not militarily useful. He preferred the walls. Saguntum had something he had not fully accounted for in the pre-siege intelligence. It had professional engineers. Not his kind of professional. Not siege engineers. Urban engineers. Men who built and maintained the water system and the drainage and the public structures. Men who understood stone and load and stress because the city had needed such men for generations. In the first month, these engineers had worked for the defensive commander. They had looked at the approaches from inside the walls. They identified the same vulnerabilities his engineers were identifying from outside. They had gone to work. He understood what was happening when the secondary barriers appeared. These were not built by soldiers. Soldiers built differently. The secondary barriers were built by men who understood stone under stress. He adjusted his assessment. The city had a technical capability he had misjudged. He would need to account for this capability in the timeline. He revised the estimate. 8 months became 8.5. The inner boundary held. The garrison of Saguntum was perhaps 3,000 men. This was his estimate from the observable defensive activity in the first month. You could estimate garrison size from the density and frequency of response to assault activity. 3,000 was his figure. 3,000 men defending a walled city on a hill with stored food and professional engineers. A clear mission. This was a significant force. The city was designed to be defended. He had brought 90,000. The arithmetic was not the point. 3,000 inside a fortified hill city were not the same. Not the same as 3,000 men in the field. The advantage factor for defensive ground was variable and depended on everything. But it was always positive. He had siege equipment, numbers, and time. The garrison had walls, elevation, and grain. The race was the grain. It always was. He had a particular way of watching assault operations. He found a position with good sight lines and he stood in it and watched. He did not move much when he was watching. He found that watching well required stillness. Movement attracted attention from the men he was watching and changed their behavior in small ways. He wanted to see how they operated naturally. He watched the assault teams at the towers. He watched which officers coordinated between towers effectively and which sent word too slowly. He watched which teams held their formations under defensive fire and which scattered. He made notes in his head. He had been making notes in his head since he was 9 years old. By now the system for notes in his head was well organized. He could retrieve things from it reliably. Not the way you retrieve things from a written ledger. The way you retrieve things from a space you had been in before and knew well. He would remember which officers had been slow at the towers in the first month. In 20 years he would still remember. He would not use the information. The time for using it would be long past. He would remember it anyway. He had a conversation with Bastar on the 42nd day of the siege. They were at the engineer's position at the base of the eastern approach. Bastar had a plan he wanted to show. Bastar showed him a diagram of the primary approach, revised. He had found a way to move the second tower forward. A change of the wheelbase worked out in the previous week. The change added 2 days of construction but reduced the approach time by 3 days. He looked at the diagram for a while. He said, "The wheelbase change. What does it do to the stability?" Bastar said, "Under normal conditions, nothing. On a slope greater than 8 degrees, it reduces stability by a calculable amount." He said, "The eastern approach in the second section has what slope?" Bastar said, "Approximately 6 degrees." He said, "Build it." Bastar built it. The tower moved into position on day 49, 6 days ahead of the original schedule. The change had worked exactly as Bastar calculated. He did not mention this to Bastar. Bastar knew. The daily rhythm of the siege settled into something he had not anticipated. He had anticipated the logistics, the supply, the engineering, the rotation, the briefings. He had planned for all of this, and it ran as planned. What he had not anticipated was the particular quality of time in a siege. A siege was a contest of endurance. Both sides were waiting for the other side to run out of something. His side was waiting for Saguntum to run out of food and defenders. Saguntum was waiting for him to run out of patience or supplies or army. This created a specific relationship with time. Time was the medium. Everything happened inside time. Every engineering advance, every assault, every diplomatic exchange, all of it was consuming time, and time was what both sides were managing. He found himself acutely aware of the days in a way he had not been in field operations. In field operations, time was elastic. Things happened fast or slow depending on the engagement. In the siege, time moved at the same rate every day. The sun came up and the sun went down, and the day had been what it had been. He counted the days. He had been counting since the first day. Not on paper. In his head. He always knew what day of the siege it was. When the city fell, it was day 241. He knew this immediately when the wall came down. Day 241. He had thought before the siege about what the defenders would do. Not in the sense of specific defensive moves. Specifically, what decisions a defensive commander made when a large force was coming. When he had a winter to prepare. He had compiled the answer from accounts of other sieges. What defenders did when they had time. They stockpiled. Grain, water, weapons, timber for barriers. Everything that would be harder to get once the army arrived. They identified the weakest sections of the wall and reinforced them. The sections the attackers would study. The sections the attackers would likely target. They organized their population. Who could fight? Who could carry materials? Who could maintain the water system? A besieged city had to function as a military unit and a functioning community. At the same time, they sent for help, messages to Rome, to allied tribes, to anyone who might respond. He had accounted for all of these. The stockpile explained the 8-month estimate. The reinforced sections explained why the first assault had been harder than the engineering assessments predicted. The organized population explained the secondary barriers. The messages to Rome he had discounted. Rome was far. Rome had its own timeline. He had calculated that timeline and was inside it. What he had not fully accounted for was the quality of the people inside. Not their courage. Not their numbers. Their professional knowledge. The urban engineers. The people who had been building and maintaining a city on a difficult hill for generations. He had adjusted for this. The adjustment was small. The principle behind the adjustment was important. Know what you are taking before you take it. He had known Saguntum as a place. He had spent 3 days there as a trader. He had walked the streets and talked to vendors and noted the granaries. He had not known what the city knew about itself. He learned this during the siege. He had a specific policy about what he ate during sieges. He ate what the forward units ate. Not the same meals every day. The rotation that served the forward units. What they had when they had it. This was not austerity for its own sake. It was information. The supply chain for a siege was always under pressure. The easiest places for that pressure to show were the units furthest from the supply depot. The forward units were furthest. If the supply chain was working, the forward units ate adequately. If the supply chain was under strain, the forward units felt it first. He ate with the forward units and knew the state of the supply chain more accurately than any report. In the 4th month, the meals became slightly smaller. Not noticeably, slightly. He noted this. He walked to the supply depot that afternoon and talked to the logistics officer. There was a problem with the southern grain route. One of the Iberian villages had renegotiated its arrangement. The new terms were workable but had reduced the weekly throughput by approximately 8%. He had the problem resolved in 3 days. He had known about it before the report because he ate with the forward units. He had thought about what it meant to be responsible for a siege, not the military responsibility. He had carried military responsibility since he was 26, and it had become a familiar weight. He managed it the way he managed everything. Systematically, with preparation, without drama. The other responsibility was harder to name. A siege was a specific thing. It was organized starvation and attrition. It was a method. The method had a purpose. The purpose was legitimate, in the terms of how armies operated in this time and place. He did not question the legitimacy. He had made his decision. The decision was made. What he thought about was the cost. Not on his side. On the city's side. He had walked through cities that had been taken before. He knew what the cost looked like. He was adding this city to that knowledge in real time. He was on the outside, doing the thing that produced the cost, watching the indicators in the behavioral patterns on the walls. He did not look away from this. He was not sure it changed anything. He thought it was important not to look away anyway. He walked the forward position every morning. He counted. He watched. He noted. He kept working. 5. The breach. The catapults fired at parapet level when the towers moved. That was the sequence. The towers could not go forward if the defenders held the parapet. The catapults cleared the parapet while the towers moved. The towers then reached the wall. The men on the upper platforms crossed onto the wall. This was the theory. The smell comes first. Old stone and the particular smoke of burning pitch used in the catapult loads. Something underneath that. Something the body recognized before the mind named it. A man on the upper platform of the forward tower does not look down. He looks at the parapet. He counts the defenders he can see and the ones he cannot. He carries his shield over his head and moves toward the wall. The defenders knew the towers were coming. They had been watching the towers for 11 days at the forward position. They had time to prepare. Preparation meant extra stone at the parapet. It meant javelin reserves. It meant designated positions. They were ready. The first men across the gangplank onto the parapet went into shields and stones and bodies. Not a line. A press. 6 men across and a dozen defenders waiting. The sound of it was not the sound accounts described. It was smaller, more specific. The grunt, the crack of shield boss. The sound a man made when weight hit him all at once. The assault held for 4 minutes. Then the tower pulled back. Pull back. From up here the 2 armies are one dark line across the face of the hill. The towers move back from the wall. The pouring out of men and equipment. The defenders thin at the parapet. Smoke from the catapult loads. 20,000 men at a fortified hill. And from this height not one of them has a face. Then back down into it. The assault failed in the technical sense. The platform reached the wall and the men went across and the defenders stopped them. But he had watched from the ridge. He had not watched the platform. He had watched the defenders. The defenders had pre-assigned positions. They had moved to the parapet with speed and maintained discipline under pressure. Their response to a pressed assault was organized and rapid. This was a city that had been preparing. He noted the response time. He noted the position of the senior officer directing the defense. He revised 3 positions in his assault plan that afternoon. He had planned for the wall being strongest at the eastern section. The assault confirmed the eastern section was strong. It also showed him something he had not seen from the outside. The northwestern approach was thinner than his initial survey had suggested. The Greek-style upper courses on the northwestern face were older than the Iberian lower courses on the eastern face. The repair work visible from outside was not a repair to weakness. It was a repair to age. The weakness was not where he had planned for it. He adjusted. He spent the evening with Bostar at the wall diagram. They worked until the fires were low and the camp was settling into its nighttime sounds. He said, "Here." He put his finger on the diagram at the northern section where the original foundation had been compromised by drainage. He said, "The limestone shelf I found 2 years ago. Start there." Bostar said, "The angle is less efficient." He said, "The angle is less efficient to the wall. It is more efficient to the foundation." Bostar looked at the diagram. He said, 2 weeks to reach it properly." He said, "Begin tomorrow." The second assault used what he had learned. He kept the towers as distraction. He moved 2 assault units to the northwestern approach under cover of the tower activity. He had catapults ranging the parapet at the northwestern section specifically. The defenders had organized around the eastern threat. The northwestern section was thinner. The second assault lasted 7 minutes before the wall threw it back. But his men reached the parapet on the northwestern section and held for 3 of those 7 minutes. In those 3 minutes, his senior engineer counted the thickness of the upper courses at 5 separate points. The engineer came back and gave him the numbers. He looked at the numbers for a long time. He said, "The tunnel goes here." He pointed at a specific section 2/3 of the way along the northern face. He went to the breach himself on the 9th day, not to fight, to look. He moved through the assault units and stood at the near wall and looked at it. His officers were around him with their shields. He waved them back. He stood close and put his hands on the stone and felt the construction. He was looking at the northwestern section his engineer had surveyed. The upper courses were more precise than the lower. Greek-style construction, smaller stones, more carefully placed. He looked at where this construction met the Iberian lower work. There was a joint, not a weakness in the structural sense. A difference. The 2 traditions had been built at different times by different hands. The joint was where the building cultures met. 2 centuries of rain had worked at that joint in the way rain worked at any difference. He said to Bostar, "The joint." Bostar said, "I see it." He said, 2 weeks from now, with the tunnel at the foundation, how do we use the joint?" Bostar thought. He said, "We heat the foundation and the joint together. The 2 stresses find each other. The section yields at both points simultaneously." He said, "Begin." He walked back through the assault units. The sun was coming up. He could feel it on his back. The smell of the siege was ash and old stone, the tang of metal that had been working in heat. He was hit on the 14th day. He was at the forward position observing the morning assault. A sortie came out of the southern gate at an unexpected angle. His bodyguard moved. The javelin caught him at the outer muscle of the upper left thigh. He went down. He was back on his feet in the time it took to understand what had happened. The wound was deep but had not hit the bone. He could tell by how the leg moved under him. Bone hits were different. He had seen enough of them. He said, "Continue the assault." His officers looked at him. He said, "Continue." He walked to the medical section. He allowed the wound to be cleaned and bound. He had specific ideas about the binding, tightness, based on what he had observed in other wounds. He slept that night in the command tent. He was back at the forward position on the 4th morning. His officers had not expected him to return so quickly. He understood that the speed of his return was information for the men. A commander who stayed in the medical section for 9 days made his absence felt as a change. A commander who returned on the 4th day was a commander whose presence was the default. He pressed his thumb against his left knuckle. The wound had stiffened the leg slightly. He noticed the adjustment his body made. He filed it. He was at the forward position every morning the wound allowed. The wound allowed it for the next 4 months. The defenders built a secondary barrier. When the first assault units went through the breach on the northern section, they found it. A wall of stone from demolished houses on the inside of the city. Heavy work, well placed. He stood at the breach and looked at the secondary barrier. It was good work. The people of Saguntum had been building with stone since before his father was born. They knew what they were doing with stone under pressure. He looked at the angles. He looked at where the barrier connected to the surviving wall on each side. He said to Bastar, "Where is the weakness?" Bastar pointed at the left connection point, where the secondary barrier met the surviving original wall on the north side. The connection was hasty, correctly done but hasty. He said, 2 days of focused work at that joint. He said, "Begin." He walked back through the breach. He had expected the secondary barrier. He had not expected how well placed it was. He noted this. He revised his estimate of the timeline by 11 days. The secondary barrier fell on the 21st day. At the connection point on the north side, where Bastar had indicated. The work had been precise and the prediction had been correct. The assault units went through. They found the third barrier. He stood at the second barrier and looked at the third. He had known about it. He looked at it without reaction. He looked at the angles and the construction. He looked at his men and their condition. He looked at the defenders visible above the third barrier. He said, "Rest the men for the afternoon. Resume at first light." His officers looked at him. He said, "They have been working since before dawn. Rest them." The men rested. He sat alone in the tent that afternoon. He thought about the third barrier, and the fourth barrier probably already being built behind it. He thought about the people inside the city, what they had already given, what they would give before it was over. He thought about Saguntum not as an obstacle but as a fact that was taking longer than planned and costing more than planned. It would end the way it was going to end, regardless of how many barriers were built. He sat with this for a while. Then he called Bastar in and asked where the third barrier was weakest. The 5th month arrived. He had been here since spring. It was now deep summer. The coast below Saguntum was visible from the forward position on clear mornings. The sea moved the way it always moved, with no interest in what was happening on the hill above it. He had lost 431 men since the start of the siege. He knew the number exactly. He reviewed it each morning. He knew the breakdown by unit and by week and by cause. The cause breakdown was what mattered for the next phase. Javelin, 42%. Falling stone, 28%. Falling burning material, 16%. Close combat in the breach, 14%. The javelin percentage told him the defenders still had supply. The falling stone percentage was lower than he expected. The defenders were being careful with stone because stone was finite. When the stone percentage dropped further, it would mean the defensive supply was tightening. He watched the numbers week by week. He received reports from Rome throughout the siege. Not official reports. Information from traders who moved between Massalia and Cartagena. From Gallic contacts who knew what was happening in the harbors. From a source in Carthage who monitored the Roman delegations as they came and went. Rome was debating. This was always the first stage. Rome debated every major decision. The debate had form and procedure and took time. He had planned for the time. The debate was moving toward consensus on action. The action would be either a military response or a formal declaration of war. A military response would require positioning a fleet and a land army near enough to intervene. The fleet could reach the coast of Spain in 6 weeks if it left immediately. The land army could not reach Spain in less than 3 months. He had 4 months of siege remaining, by his revised estimate. He was not concerned about the fleet. He was not concerned about the land army. He was concerned about the declaration, which would start the clock on something larger. The declaration was coming regardless of what happened at Saguntum. He had known this since before the siege. The siege was the declaration in practical form. The formal words from Rome were a response to the fact already in progress. He filed the reports and kept working. The secondary barrier was built from 2 sources of material. The first source was stone from buildings demolished along the inside of the wall. The defenders had selected buildings that were structurally secondary. Storage buildings, animal pens, structures that the population could lose without losing function. They had demolished these carefully, keeping the stones intact where possible, and moved the stones to the breach point. The second source was less expected. The defenders had used the paving stones from the main market square. The market square was 40 yards from the breach point. Large flat stones, well cut, heavy. They had pulled them up from the ground where they had been set and moved them by teams. On the second day of the breach assault, he stood at the secondary barrier. He ran his hand over the surface. He felt the flat face of what had been a paving stone. He felt the cut edges. Someone inside had understood that the market square was less important than the breach. This was good thinking. This was the kind of thinking that added time to a siege. He noted it without resentment. He respected good thinking wherever it appeared. The men at the breach were rotating every 4 hours. He had set the rotation at 4 hours. 4 hours in breach fighting was the maximum for effective unit discipline. Beyond 4 hours, the discipline degraded in ways that were not dramatic but that mattered. The men made decisions they would not have made at hour 1. They took angles they should not have taken. They missed signals. He had learned this rotation principle from an account of an Athenian siege. Read during the years under Hasdrubal. The principle was stated clearly in the account and supported by the outcomes described. He had filed it. He had also tested it at the Vacii. The first city had been taken without breach fighting. The second city had required it. He had used 4-hour rotations at the second city. He had compared the unit performance to accounts where rotations had been longer. The comparison supported the principle. He trusted principles that came from multiple sources. One source was data. 2 sources were information. 3 or more sources were close enough to fact for working purposes. For hours, he trusted this number. He inspected the men at the breach position on the morning of the 3rd day. He did not do this often. He did not want the men at the forward positions to feel monitored. Men who felt monitored changed their behavior. He wanted to see behavior, not performance. But the 3rd day of a breach assault was a particular moment. The first day was intensity and intensity. The second day was the adjustment. The 3rd day was where you found out what the men were actually made of. Not the men who worked well under intensity. The men who worked well when the intensity was gone and the reality of the thing had settled in. He walked the breach position in the 3rd hour of the morning. He went from unit to unit. He looked at the men. He looked at their equipment. He spoke to 3 unit commanders, asking about supply and rest and specific problems. He noted 2 units where the men had the quality he was looking for. He noted one unit where the quality was absent. He would need to rotate that unit out faster and give it something different. He made no announcements. He walked back to the main position. He sent a message to the unit rotation officer with the adjustment. The wounded from the breach work came to the field station in a steady flow. Not a flood. Steady flow. 3 or 4 men per hour from the forward position. The medical team had been organized for this rate and handled it smoothly. He visited the field station in the evening of the second day. He walked through the sections. He spoke to Sinhalus about the supply of specific materials that were running lower than the replenishment could cover. He looked at the men who were there. Not all of them. The station was large. He spent time in 2 sections. He stopped at several positions and asked how the man was doing. Men responded differently to a general who stopped to ask. Some of them became formal. They straightened up and reported in proper form. Some of them said what was true. He preferred the second kind of answer. He did not tell the men this. He simply waited after the first answer, and usually the second answer followed. One man said, "The noise from the breach at night. It does not stop." He said, "I know." The man said, "The men who are not at the breach think it will stop soon." He said, "They are not wrong." He meant this. The breach was close to its purpose. 3 more days, perhaps 4. It would be over. The man did not ask for confirmation. He nodded. The defenders inside Saguntum had a commander. He did not know this man's name. He had tried to find it through the network of pre-siege informants. The informants had given him 2 names, both uncertain. He could not verify either. He thought about this commander sometimes. Not often. Thinking about the enemy commander was not strategically productive when the situation was as clear as this one. But sometimes, in the evenings, he thought about the man on the other side of the wall. The secondary barriers. The careful use of stone from the market square. The 4-hour rotation that the defenders seemed to be using, mirroring his own. The sortie in the 7th month, timed precisely for the gap in his rotation. This was a competent commander. A competent commander inside a city that was going to fall. There was a specific sadness in that. Not the sadness of sympathy, the sadness of waste. A mind that could manage a siege defense this well. Applied to a situation where management was not going to be enough. He thought about this for a while and then put it away. The situation was what it was. He had a particular policy about the men he lost. He counted them. Every day, after the morning briefing, he received the casualty report. He reviewed it in the same way he reviewed every report. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the unit distribution. He looked at the cause breakdown. He did not memorize names from the casualty report. He had made this decision early in his command. If he memorized names from the casualty report, the report became something different. It became something he carried. He could not carry thousands of names and also carry the decisions required. What he memorized was the numbers. The daily numbers. The cumulative numbers. The numbers by unit and cause and phase of the siege. The numbers were real. The numbers were his responsibility in the way that names could not be, for working reasons. 431 men, by the time the wall fell. He knew this number exactly. He had tracked it every day. He would know it for the rest of his life. The assault that took the final section of the inner wall lasted 7 hours. Not the assault itself. The fighting in the interior after the inner wall came down. The defenders who were still capable of fighting made their stand in the upper section of the city. They had chosen the buildings with the best natural defense. Stone walls, narrow approaches, height. He was not in this fighting. He was at the command position below. He received reports and issued adjustments and tracked the situation on his map. At the 4th hour, the resistance began concentrating in the administrative center. The defenders were pulling back to one location. He gave orders to the encirclement units. Surround it. Do not go in. Wait. They waited for 3 more hours. Then the sound inside the administrative center stopped. He gave the signal to enter. The city had fallen. The sound of breach fighting was different from open field fighting. In the field, sound spread out. You heard things from many directions. The commands, the horses, the weapons, the specific sounds of different weapons. All of it moving and spreading across open ground. In the breach, the sound was compressed. The breach was narrow. The stone walls on both sides directed the sound forward and back. Every sound was louder than it should have been. The sounds built on each other. He had been warned about this by an officer who had fought in several sieges. The officer had said, "Your ears will tell you it is more than it is. You have to look past your ears." He had thought about this warning for several months before the siege began. He had designed the assault rotation partly around it. Fresh units heard the breach accurately. Units that had been in it too long heard it incorrectly. The rotation kept the hearing accurate. He stood at the breach position on the 4th day and listened. He heard what the breach was, not what his ears wanted to tell him it was. The defenders were concentrated at the northern section of the secondary barrier. The southern section was under less pressure. This was information. It meant the northern section was either more important to them or more accessible to the men they still had. He gave orders to increase pressure at the southern section, not to break through at the south, to force the defenders to redistribute. An hour later, the northern section became slightly less defended. His assault units took 2 yards. 2 yards was significant. 2 yards in breach fighting was an hour's work. 2 yards was what you measured a day by. 6. The months. The 6th month. The supply situation inside Saguntum had become what he had calculated it would become. Not from intelligence reports. From the rate of change in the defensive activity. In the first 3 months, the defenders on the wall had been consistent. They appeared in predictable numbers at predictable times. They responded to assault activity with consistent force. In the 4th month, the numbers at the parapet began varying. Some mornings there were fewer. Some days the response to assault activity was slower. In the 5th month, the timing of the response had become irregular. An assault that would have drawn an immediate stone response in the 1st month now sometimes drew a delayed response. Sometimes no response at all. He tracked this through his own observation. He did not tell his officers what he was watching. He watched and counted. By the 6th month, the pattern was clear. The defenders were managing a resource problem. They had food, or they did not have people, or they had both problems at once. From outside the wall, you could not know which. From outside the wall, all you could know was the behavioral pattern. The behavioral pattern said, "Something has changed inside." He had informants in the surrounding villages, not inside Saguntum itself. The city had closed its gates in spring and no one left. The people who might have had information were inside and staying inside. The surrounding villages were different. Traders and farmers who had been in and out of Saguntum before the siege had information. Not current information. Pre-siege information about the city's supply arrangements. How much had been stored. Where. What the city's population was. He had gathered this information before the siege began. He had built a model from it. How many people per ton of grain? How many tons were likely stored? How many months that represented? His model said 8 months was the upper range. The 6th month had arrived and the behavioral patterns on the wall confirmed the model was running on time. He revised nothing. The model was working. Rome sent a second formal delegation to Carthage in the 6th month. He received this information from his source in Carthage. The delegation had arrived, made its presentation, received the standard response, and departed. The standard response was the same response the council always gave on this question. The war was Hannibal's decision. The council supported its general in the field. The response was accurate. It was also carefully worded. The council was not technically endorsing the war. The council was saying that the general had authority to make decisions in the field. This was a different statement. It was the same statement with a different emphasis depending on what happened next. He had expected this. He had expected Carthage to remain technically non-committed while the outcome was still uncertain. This was how councils worked when they were uncertain. They committed when the outcome was visible. He was going to make the outcome visible. He sent a brief report to Carthage after receiving the intelligence. He stated the military situation. He stated his assessment of the timeline. He did not ask for anything. He did not offer reassurance. The report was the kind of report that a man sent when he was confident and did not need confirmation. He fought the Saguntine sortie in the 7th month. The defenders opened the main gate in the early morning. His forward camp had not yet completed its rotation change. 300 men came out. They moved fast. They knew the ground. They hit the engineering position at the North Tower base. They destroyed 2 weeks of tunnel work in 11 minutes. He was at the rear camp when it started. He arrived at the forward position as the defenders were pulling back inside the gate. He stood and looked at what they had done. He was not angry. He was interested. 300 men, organized enough to hit a specific target, move fast, and return before the camp could respond effectively. This told him several things. The defenders were not as depleted as the behavioral patterns at the wall had suggested. Or they were that depleted, and this sortie had used everything they had left. He looked at the tunnel work. 2 weeks of work. The engineers were already assessing the damage. Bastar came to him within the hour. Bastar said, 2 weeks to repair. If we modify the approach slightly, we recover the ground in 10 days. He said, modify the approach. He said to Bastar, the men who came out this morning, which gate and which direction did they come from? Bastar described the gate and the movement. He said, the next sortie, if there is one, will come from the same gate. Put a unit at the base of the hill on that side. Not visible from the wall. 50 cavalry. When the gate opens, they move. There was no second sortie. In the 7th month, 3 Saguntine citizens came to negotiate. He had received delegations before. Twice in the 1st month, before the main assault had begun, city delegates had come to propose arrangements. He had said the same thing both times. Complete surrender. This delegation was different. The 3 men looked like men who had been inside a besieged city for 7 months. He did not look away from this. He looked at it carefully. He gave them water, not wine. Water. They said, the city would accept a Carthaginian presence with guaranteed rights for the citizens. Property rights, council rights, the right to continue their connection with Rome. He said, the city would surrender to Carthage. All terms to be set by Carthage. No prior conditions. The lead citizen said, we have held for 7 months. He said, I know. You have done it well. He said, the terms will be what they will be. I cannot tell you they will be good terms. I can tell you they will be applied once and not revised. The citizens looked at each other. They went back inside. He sat for a while after they left. He thought about what the delegation had looked like. The look of men who had been managing a shrinking supply for 7 months. Representing people who were not visible. People inside walls. He had done his calculations. The walls were going to come down. He had committed 8 months of his life and 431 of his men's lives to this calculation. The calculation was going to be correct. He went back to work. The engineering repairs took 12 days instead of 10. The approach change Bostar had suggested required moving the primary tunnel axis 6 degrees north. 12 degrees was the original angle. 6 degrees north was 18 degrees from the wall face. The geometry was less efficient. The geometry also put the tunnel under a section of the original foundation that had not been worked before. The new section was better stone than the original section. Harder. Bostar came to him with this and said, 2 more days. He said, take them. 14 days total for the repair. He noted this in his morning review and adjusted the overall timeline. The adjustment was small. One of many small adjustments that added up over the course of a siege. He had learned to track the cumulative weight. Individual adjustments looked minor. The sum of adjustments was the actual timeline. The actual timeline was still within his original outer estimate. He wrote to his wife in the 7th month. He had not written since the beginning of the siege. He did not write often. There was nothing in a siege that he wanted her to know about as it was happening. The siege was the kind of thing you described afterward if you described it at all. He wrote briefly. He said the campaign was proceeding as planned. He said the weather on the Spanish coast in summer was mild. He said he would be moving north after this was finished. He said, the boy should know that he has a father. Tell him something about me. Whatever seems right to you. He did not know what else to say. He sealed the letter and sent it with a courier heading south to Cartagena. Then he went back to the wall. The wall came down in the 8th month. The tunnel work under the modified north approach had reached a critical depth. Bostar called him forward before dawn. They looked at the assessment. Bostar was very specific. The load-bearing section above the tunnel was compromised. One controlled fire at the critical point and the wall section would collapse. He said, tomorrow morning. Bostar said, the moon will be good tonight. We could do it now. He said, tomorrow morning. I want full visibility for the assault. They waited for morning. He ran the siege in 3 overlapping rhythms. The daily rhythm, morning briefing, position check, supply review, casualty report, equipment assessment, adjustment orders. This took 2 hours most mornings and longer when something had changed overnight. The weekly rhythm, a review of the overall situation against the model. Was the siege proceeding at the rate planned? Where were the variances? What adjustments did the variances require? He sat with the map and his notes every 7 days and compared what was to what should be. The monthly rhythm, a full reassessment. The grain question, revisited. The siege equipment, reassessed. The Army's condition, evaluated against what it needed to be when the siege ended and the march north began. All 3 rhythms had been running since the first week. He had invented the 3-rhythm structure during the winter before the siege began. He had been thinking about how to manage a long operation, how to keep the overall picture without losing the immediate details. A commander who only managed immediate details lost the campaign. A commander who only managed the overall picture lost control of the details. 3 rhythms. Daily, weekly, monthly. He had not seen the structure described in any account he had read. He had derived it from thinking about what would be needed. He used it at Saguntum and it worked. He would use it for everything afterward. He maintained a physical standard throughout the siege. This was a practical decision, not a display. He ran every day, not far, 2 miles, sometimes 3. In the early morning before the briefing, when the camp was beginning to wake. He ran at the same pace every day, regardless of what had happened the previous day. The pace was a standard, not a goal. He was not trying to run faster or farther. He was trying to maintain the baseline. A siege was sedentary work for a commander. He issued orders and received reports and looked at maps and walked to positions and came back. The body lost what it was not using. A commander who let the body decline had fewer reserves when the reserves were needed. He had seen this in other commanders. Not dramatically, slowly. Over months, the quality of the thinking degraded in ways that were hard to identify specifically. The connections between pieces of information became slower. The sense of timing dulled slightly. He attributed this, at least partly, to the sedentary nature of siege command. He ran every day. In the 4th month, he asked Bastar to show him the full picture of the siege engineering. Not the current state, the full picture, where they had been, where they were going. Bastar spread his diagrams across the table. They covered the table completely and some had to be stacked. He had been documenting every engineering decision since the first day. The diagrams showed the work in sequence. The approach clearing, the first tower positions, the tunnel attempts, the limestone discovery, the modified approach, the breach, the secondary barriers. He looked at the full picture for a long time. He could see things in the full picture that he could not see in any single day's report. The weight, the direction of progress, the places where the work had been efficient, the places where it had taken longer, the reasons for the difference. He said to Bastar, "In the next operation, I want this picture available every 2 weeks, not just at the end." Bastar said, "I can do that." He said, "I should have asked for it earlier here." This was a rare statement from him, not an apology, a fact. Bastar said, "The picture was not this large earlier. 2 weeks into any siege it would have been 2 diagrams." He said, "In 2 weeks it tells you which direction you are going." Bastar said, "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the full picture for a while longer. Then he said, "Show me the 4th month again. Specifically." Rome's position on Saguntum had changed by the 6th month. In the first months, the Roman Senate position had been clear. Saguntum was under protection. The siege must stop. Continuation was a hostile act. This was the position delivered by the 3 embassies. By the 6th month, the Senate position was less clear. His source in Cartagena, who had contacts in Roman trading families, reported a shift in tone. The Senate was no longer debating whether to respond. It was debating what the response should be. Whether to send military force to Spain directly or to take the declaration route and prepare for a broader war. The shift from whether to what meant the Senate had accepted that the siege would not stop. This was useful information. It meant the Senate was now thinking about what came after Saguntum, which meant they were thinking about where Rome would be positioned when the siege ended, which meant they were thinking about Spain and about the sea route and about their military deployments. He had been thinking about all of these things for 2 years. He was ahead of the Senate's thinking. He needed to stay ahead of it. The window mattered. He had a method for managing uncertainty. He called it the outer and inner boundary. Every estimate he made had an inner boundary and an outer boundary. The inner boundary was the optimistic case. The outer boundary was the pessimistic case. The working plan was built around the inner boundary, with a buffer that could absorb the outer boundary without catastrophic failure. For the Saguntum siege, the inner boundary had been 7 months and the outer had been 9. He had planned for 8, which sat between them and allowed for variance in either direction. The march north had inner and outer boundaries too. Inner, arrive at the Alps by late summer. Outer, arrive at the Alps by early autumn. The plan was built around the inner boundary. The buffer was the routes he had identified that could reduce travel time if he fell behind. He applied the structure to everything. He had applied it since he was a young officer watching his father plan operations. Hamilcar had never explained this method. He had observed it in his father's behavior and systematized it himself. The method was not original to him. He suspected it was as old as organized warfare. He had simply noticed it and named it and applied it consistently. He received a letter from Carthage in the 7th month. Not from the council. From a specific faction within the council that had been watching the siege with particular attention. The letter said, in formal Punic, that certain council members had concerns about the declaration of war and the strategic direction of the operation. The letter asked for reassurance that the situation was under control. He read the letter. He read it again. He set it aside. He wrote a response the following morning. He stated the military facts. He stated the timeline. He stated what he expected to happen and when. He did not offer reassurance in the emotional sense. He offered facts. He sent the response. He did not think much about the letter after that. The council concerned him less than the Alps. The Alps were a physical problem with physical solutions. The council was a political problem. He had not spent his career learning to manage political problems. He had people for that. In the meantime, he sent facts. Facts were useful to people who were capable of using them. He found in the 7th month that he had begun to dream about the march north. Not dramatic dreams, practical ones. He would be in a pass he had never seen working through a problem with the route. He would be managing a river crossing with some new complication. He would be working through a supply problem with an officer he had not yet assigned. He did not put significance on this. He knew what caused it. He had been planning the march for 2 years. The plan was increasingly present in his thinking as the siege neared completion. The dreams were the planning running on a different substrate. He noted it without concern. He was ready for the march. He had been ready for several months. The siege had been the thing standing between his readiness and his departure. The siege was ending. He could feel it in the day-to-day reports. Not dramatically, in the small quantities, the rate of defensive response, the timing of the supply-resupply rotations, the quality of the materials the defenders were using for the inner barriers. Things running out look a certain way. He had been watching for it since the 1st month. It was here now. The Saguntum water system was a work of significant engineering. He had known about it from the pre-siege intelligence. The city had built its primary water supply into the rock of the hill 3 generations ago. The cisterns were carved into the limestone. The channels were lined with fired clay. The system could supply the city for several months on stored water alone, independent of any surface source. This had extended his timeline estimate. A city with a reliable internal water supply faced different pressure. Not the same as a city dependent on external water. He had added 2 weeks to his outer boundary estimate because of the water system. He had looked at whether he could interfere with the water system from outside. He had concluded he could not. The system was entirely internal. The access points were inside the walls. There was no external vulnerability. He had accepted this as a given and planned around it. On the day the city fell, the water was still running. He noted this as a positive. Running water in a captured city made everything easier. He had given instructions before the fall that the water infrastructure was to be preserved. His officers knew this. The water was running when his soldiers entered. This was good planning meeting good engineering. He noted both. In the 5th month, he had a conversation with a Libyan cavalry officer. He thought about it for years afterward. The officer's name was Naravas. He had been with the army for 8 years. He was not a senior officer. He was a mid-level commander of perhaps 200 riders. Naravas came to him one evening at the forward position. He asked to speak. He said yes. Naravas said, "The men are asking about the march. Not here. After this." He said, "What are they asking?" Naravas said, "They are asking where it ends." He looked at Naravas for a moment. He said, "Italy." Naravas said, "And after Italy?" He said, "That depends on what happens in Italy." Naravas was quiet. He said, "Tell the men it ends in Italy. Tell them what happens after Italy is for Italy to decide." Naravas nodded. He went back to his men. He sat with the conversation for a while. It was a fair question. He did not have a complete answer to it. He had a plan for the next 18 months. He had a broader intention for the years after. The broader intention was not a plan. It was a direction. He thought about the difference between a plan and a direction. Plan was specific. It had steps. It had a sequence. Could be executed. A direction was the thing the plan was aimed at. It did not have steps. He had both. He had a plan that aimed at a direction. He was executing the plan. What happened when the plan succeeded was something he would decide when the plan had succeeded. He had not told Naravas this because it was not useful to the riders. 7. The fall. The wall came down at dawn. The fire at the tunnel base caught at the second watch. By the time the sky began to lighten, the tunnel was burning well. The sound of it was underground and muffled. The ground above the tunnel had a quality to it that the engineers recognized. At dawn, the section gave. The wall came down in 2 stages. First the base, which compressed and cracked at the weakened point. Then the upper section, which tilted for a moment and then followed. The sound of the second stage was different from the first. Heavier. The fall of stone that had been in one place for 100 years. The dust rose before the sound finished. Dense and pale in the early light. He had the assault units moving before the dust cleared. This assault was different from the breach work. The previous breaches had been technical. Engineering against engineering. His men against stone and the defenders behind stone. This was the final assault. The city had held for 8 months. The city knew this was the end. His men knew this was the end. Both sides had been here long enough to understand what the end looked like. He was at the breach point by midday. He moved through the assault units into the city. He had a guard with him. He looked at what 8 months of siege looked like from inside the walls. The streets were narrow. The smoke of fires from the morning's assault cut the light between buildings. The buildings on both sides of the main approach were Iberian in style, stone with wooden roofing. The wooden roofing had not survived the siege well. Some of the buildings were open to the sky. He looked at the people. He looked at them carefully. After 8 months of siege, the people inside a city had a particular look. Not the look of soldiers. The look of people who had made a decision, lived with it long enough that it was now just what their life was. He did not look away from this. He walked to the treasury first. This was practical, not symbolic. The treasury needed to be secured before anything else. The treasury was in the administrative center of the city, which was on the highest point of the hill. He went there with a unit of Libyan infantry and his personal guard. The treasury was intact. The officials had not done anything to the treasury in the final hours. No burning, no dispersal. Either they had planned to negotiate a surrender protecting the treasury, or they had run out of time, or they had not made the decision at all. He noted the contents: gold and silver in stored form, trade goods in 3 rooms at the rear, bronze implements. He did not touch anything. He left a guard and went back out. He had promised the army the treasury. He would distribute it as he had promised. He found one of the 3 negotiators in the main square. The man was sitting against a wall on the far side of the square. He was not injured. He was sitting quietly, looking at the ground. He stopped in front of the man. The man looked up. He said, "Is the council intact?" The man said, "Some of them." He said, "I need them assembled. This afternoon or tomorrow morning." The man said nothing for a moment. He said, "We held for 8 months." He said, "Yes." He said, "And you are still here." The man said, "And you are still here." He said, "I am always still here. That is the nature of the siege. The city can stop the siege by surrendering. The army cannot stop it at all." He walked on. He would deal with the council. He would set the terms. The terms would be what he had said they would be, applied once, not revised. He walked through the city for the rest of the afternoon. He had done this after every siege, not as ceremony, as information gathering. What the city was, what it had been, what it would be, what was intact and what was not, where the infrastructure was and where it had been damaged. The water system was intact. The Saguntines had built their water system into the rock of the hill, and it had survived everything. He noted this. A working water system was worth considerable practical value. The grain stores were, as his model had predicted, nearly empty. Not entirely empty. There was grain remaining, enough for another 2 or 3 weeks at siege ration levels. The siege had ended at the right time, not because he had been lucky, because his model had been correct. He found a section of the city near the northern wall where several hundred people had gathered. Not fighters, people, families, the old, children looking at the soldiers moving through the streets, with the focused attention children brought to things beyond their comprehension. He walked through this section slowly. One of his guards started moving people back, and he told the guard to stop. He moved through without clearing the path. He looked at what he was moving through. He had done this since his father's time. You walked through the cost. You did not flinch from it. You did not explain it. You did not use it for feeling things. You noted it. The cost of a siege was real, and it was his responsibility, and he looked at it. He turned and walked back to the main gate. He distributed the treasury on the following morning. He did it by unit in order of service at the forward position. The units that had been at the wall the most received the most. He had calculated the distribution before the siege was over, based on the rotation records. He had the figures ready. The distribution took most of the morning. He watched it happen from the camp entrance. The units came and received their share and went back to their positions. The process was orderly. It was orderly because he had made it orderly in advance. Distributions after sieges were often chaotic. Chaotic distributions led to disputes that led to things he did not want in his camp. He had been thinking about the distribution since the 3rd month. He thought about most things since the 3rd month of any project. The survivors of Saguntum were divided into 3 groups. Those who could work would go to the labor force. He needed workers for the march north. He needed them in good condition, food and medical attention and rest before they could be useful. He gave orders for this. Those who could not work would be sold in the nearest markets. Those who had been specifically identified as having led resistance against Carthage would be held separately. He would deal with them after the march arrangements were finalized. He did not make announcements about this. He gave instructions to his officers. The officers carried out the instructions. The process was visible to anyone who was watching but was not announced. He had seen other commanders make speeches after sieges. He had decided against speeches after sieges when he was 23. Speeches after sieges said things that were not accurate. They named the experience as something it was not. He preferred to leave the experience as what it was. He walked back into the camp. He had started a war. The war was real now. He needed to move. He had been drafting them since the 7th month. The march north was not a new plan. It was a plan that had been waiting for the siege to end. The siege had ended. The plan activated. He had 2 things to do before the march began. The first was to settle the Saguntum question formally. The council had assembled as he had requested. He met with them for 1 hour. He set the terms. He told them what was happening to each group of survivors. He told them what the territory would be under Carthaginian authority. The council listened. They did not argue. They were 8 months past the point where argument was available. The second thing was to send his brother Hasdrubal the full briefing on the march plan. Hasdrubal would hold Spain with 10,000 men while the main army moved north. The briefing was specific. Supply lines, key agreements with local tribes, the 3 locations where he thought Rome might try to establish a presence. He wrote the briefing himself. Took 3 hours. He sealed it and sent it south. The army began moving north on the morning of the 5th day. He rode to the head of the column and turned his horse north. Behind him the camp was striking its tents. The organized dismantling of 8 months of infrastructure. It would take all morning. By midday the eastern hillside below Saguntum would show only the marks of where the camp had been. He did not look back. Saguntum was behind him. The sea was to his right. The road north along the coast was ahead. He counted the army as he rode. Not exactly. A general's count. By unit, by rough number, by condition. The count matched what it should match. He rode north. The war had started. He was moving. He had thought about what a fallen city meant from the first month of the siege. Not in meaning. Practically. A fallen city was a logistical event. Produced people, goods, and infrastructure. The people needed to be managed. The goods needed to be counted and allocated. The infrastructure needed to be assessed for use or abandonment. He had prepared for this in the same way he prepared for everything. He had assigned specific officers to specific duties. 1 officer for the population management. 1 for the treasury and goods. 1 for the infrastructure assessment. The assignments had been made in the 4th month, when it was clear the siege was proceeding as planned. The officers had their instructions. They knew what to do when the city fell. The fall happened. The officers did what they were instructed to do. It was orderly. He had spent 20 years watching things that were not orderly. He had concluded that the difference between orderly and disorderly was almost entirely preparation. Not talent, not instinct. Preparation. You decided in advance what would happen and assigned it to specific people and gave them specific instructions. The decision in the moment was almost always too late. The Saguntine Council met with him on the evening of the 2nd day after the fall. There were 7 of them. 2 were the original the officials from before the siege. The other 5 were secondary officials who had stepped up as the siege had depleted the leadership. He sat across from them at a table in the administrative building, which was still largely intact. He stated the terms. The population was divided as he had described to the negotiating delegation. Workers to the labor force, the old and infirm to the markets. Those identified as having led the resistance to be held. Property claims were extinguished. The city's assets were Carthaginian. The council had authority over the remaining population's daily needs in the transition period. He would assign a liaison officer. The liaison officer's instructions would come from him. He said, "Do you understand the terms?" The senior official said he understood. He said, "Are there questions?" There were questions. He answered them. Some of the questions he answered completely. Some he answered in part. Some he answered by explaining that the decision was not yet made. He did not apologize for anything. He stood and left. The liaison officer stayed. He found the city's engineer that afternoon. Not intentionally. He was walking through the upper quarter. A man came out of a building and stopped when he saw who he was. The man was perhaps 55. He had the look of a man who had worked with his hands most of his life. Now not working with anything. Not sure what to do with himself. He stopped. He said, "Are you the engineer? The city engineer?" The man said yes. He said, "The water system, is it fully intact?" The man looked at him for a moment. He said, "Yes. We protected it through the whole siege." He said, "You did good work with the secondary barriers." The man did not say anything. He said, "The stone from the market square. Whose idea was that?" The man said, "Mine." He nodded. He said, "It cost us a week." The man said nothing. He said, "I am going to need someone who knows the water system for the transition period. Are you willing to work?" The man looked at him for a long time. He was weighing things that were not available to weigh from his position. He said, "Yes." He said, "Report to the liaison officer. Tell him I sent you." He walked on. He spent 2 full hours alone that evening. This was unusual. He did not often spend time alone without a specific purpose. Even time that appeared idle usually had a purpose. This time was different. He had taken Saguntum. He had started the war. He had spent 8 months and 431 men and the full resources of a major siege operation. He was 27 years old. He sat in the tent and looked at the map. Not at Spain, at the full map. Spain and the Pyrenees and Gaul and the Alps. He had a map that went to Italy but not much further. The Italian peninsula ended in a reasonable approximation of the real geography. He had studied it many times. He had not been to any of it. He had been in Spain for all of it. He looked at the map and thought about what it was going to take. He had calculated it many times. He knew the numbers. He was going to have the numbers going in. He would lose some in the mountains. He would gain Italian allied troops on the other side. He would need to fight at least one battle, probably several, before he could achieve what he needed to achieve. He thought about the battle he was building toward. The flat plane, the wings, the machine going forward into the space it could not see the edges of. He had found the weakness. He had the ground. He needed to get there. He stood up. He was ready. The march order was specific. He had written it in the winter, revised it in the 4th month, revised it again after the sortie in the 7th month changed his assessment of the time available. The final march order was the 3rd revision. Sent the cavalry first, then the infantry in the order that would create the least bottleneck at the likely narrow points. The elephants were placed so they would not slow the infantry, protected by infantry if the route required it. The supply wagons were placed at the points in the column where the road was expected to be widest. Not at the rear. At the rear they added up delays. At the natural wide points they could keep pace without creating the weight. He had thought about the supply placement for 2 months. He had a diagram of the expected road conditions on the northern route. He had mapped the wagon positions against it. He showed this diagram to his logistics officer on the morning of the departure briefing. The logistics officer studied it. He asked 2 questions. He answered them. The logistics officer said, "I would move the 4th wagon group forward by 1 unit. He looked at the diagram again. He said, "Why?" The logistics officer explained. The reasoning was good. The section of road he was referencing was narrower than the plan assumed. He said, "Move it." The plan was revised for the 3rd time. He was not bothered by this. Good plans were revised when better information appeared. The revision was not a failure. The revision was the plan working correctly. He walked through the city on the 2nd morning after the fall. Not the upper quarter which he had covered the previous day. The lower quarter, the section of the city closest to the main gate. The lower quarter was where the markets had been, where the workshops were, where most of the population not in the council or garrison had lived. The kind of quarter that exists in every city. The part that produces things and sells things and exists in a specific relationship with the part that governs. He walked through it slowly. The workshops were mostly intact. Some had been damaged in the final assault. Most had survived. He saw the kinds of work that the workshops had been doing. Bronze work, pottery, leather goods, cloth. He stopped at a potter's workshop. The pots inside were finished work, waiting to be sold. They had been waiting since the siege began. They would have been waiting through 8 months of siege with the city closed around them. He picked one up and looked at it. It was ordinary work, competent but not distinctive. The kind of pot that got used daily and replaced when it broke. He set it back. He thought about the potter who had made this pot. Somewhere in the population he was now managing. Working or not working. Alive or not alive. He did not know which. He walked on. He made a decision about the Saguntum children on the 3rd day. His standing orders had separated the surviving population into 3 groups as planned. The children had been placed in the worker category by default. The category structure was adult-focused. It had not addressed children specifically. His liaison officer came to him on the 3rd morning and said, "The children question. What do you want to do?" He said, "How many?" The liaison officer said, "We estimate between 300 and 400, under 12 years. He sat with this for a while. He said, "Separate them from the general worker group. Assign them to the families of the Iberian Allied units. Units that are staying in Spain." The liaison officer said, "As servants." He said, "As wards. The families are to provide for them. In 10 years they are free." He said, "Document this specifically." The liaison officer documented it. He did not know if the record would be followed after he left for Italy. He had given the order. The order would create the record. The record was not a guarantee. He had done what he could do. He moved on. He reviewed the engineering equipment on the last day before the march. Everything that was going north would be assessed. Everything that was not going north would be left with the garrison or destroyed. He did not take the heavy siege equipment. The assault towers required too much transport and slowed the march too much for what they were worth. He took the catapult mechanisms disassembled. He took the tunnel tools. He took the portable bridge equipment that his engineers used for river crossings. He left the towers. He looked at the towers for a moment before he walked away from the equipment review. The towers had done what they were designed to do. They had moved into position, held the assault platforms, been pushed back and moved forward again for 7 months. They were battered. They were also still functional. He left them. Whatever the garrison needed from them, it could use. Whatever it did not need could rot. He walked back to the command tent. The march orders were ready. The army was ready. The supply was staged. Everything was in position. Tomorrow they moved. He thought about the Saguntum engineer for several days after the encounter. Not with guilt. With a specific kind of professional respect. The kind he did not often feel for people on the other side of a wall. The man had built the secondary barriers under siege conditions. Limited material and limited workforce. The barriers had been well built. They had cost him time and effort. The stone from the market square had been a good idea. The connection at the northern section had been better designed than at the southern section. The man had understood load transfer. He thought about what it meant to have a good engineer inside a city you were besieging. It meant the siege took longer. It meant you lost more men to well-placed stone. It meant the barriers were harder to predict. Built by someone who understood what you were trying to do. It was an advantage he could not do anything about except acknowledge. He acknowledged it. The Saguntum engineer would serve the transition. He would maintain the water system. He would train the Iberian workers assigned to the infrastructure team. He would do useful work. He had made the offer without knowing whether the man would accept it. He had made it because it was the correct offer to make to a man with those skills. The man had accepted. This was the second thing he noted about the Saguntum engineer. He had made the most rational choice available to him in a situation where most choices were very bad. He had assessed his options and chosen the one that gave him the most room to work. This was a quality Hannibal understood. Writer's note: I do not read Saguntum as the cause of the war. Hannibal wanted a war and chose Saguntum as the trigger. The city was not an accident. It was a calculation. He had been inside its walls 2 years before the army arrived. He had put his hands on the stone. He had found the weakness. He had gone home and spent 2 years building the plan around the weakness he had found. I watch him walk through the fallen city that afternoon. He does not look like a man who has won something unexpected. He looks like a man checking whether the calculation was correct. It was. He filed that too. Then he looked north. Next time, the Ebro is behind them. The Pyrenees are ahead. The army is 90,000. It will not stay that number.